Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Bernadette Calafell of Gonzaga University presents a talk entitled American Dreams, American Nightmares, La Llorona, Race, and Politics.
And we're live.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to our third time appearing, Dr. Bernadette Calafell. How are you this evening?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm well. I'm glad to see you. Last time you were on, we were four. We were a bridge party.
Yeah.
Dissecting the 78 Halloween, and now a new Halloween is out, which I haven't seen yet because I've been sitting here every night. I was texting Kendall about it yesterday, actually, and because he said he had gone on date night with Mrs. Kendall Phillips. I don't actually know her name. He's probably watching this now thinking, why is he talking about this? But I'd asked him if he'd seen it, and he had not either. And I said, well, you know how my feelings about Blumhouse. So I will see it. I think I'm actually going Tuesday. But I'm looking forward to your talk, American Dreams, American Nightmares, La Llorona, Race, and Politics. So I'm going to invite you to start when you are ready.
Great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone.
Sounds great. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, so as you can see, this is my talk and my affiliation, but let me go ahead and get started. So W. Scott Poole writes, 2 months before the election of Donald Trump, clowns began appearing at the edge of the woods. In the last hot summer days of August 2016, children living in the Fleetwood Manor apartment complex in the deeply conservative city of Greenville, South Carolina, told their parents about figures in paint with bulbous red noses attempting to lure them into the woods. Local police found nothing and no one, but the painted phantoms kept coming for the children in rumor panic that spread across the nation, with particular resonance in deeply conservative states that Trump won decisively in November. Now, I start with Poole because the figure of the clown has certainly gained prominence since the election of Donald J. Trump, and because in this talk I will ruminate on the figure in relationship to the figure of La Llorona, to consider the role of horror in the Trump era to make sense or meaning making of the societal, cultural, or political moment. Specifically, I will unpack and juxtapose the meanings around Mexican motherhood in the film The Curse of La Llorona with memes and discourses that position Trump as Pennywise the murderous clown from It. These representations work in concert to manufacture consent for family separation and the treatment and detention of migrant children at the border. Now, I'm drawing on work that's kind of in progress for a while now, as well as some recent work with one of my former graduate students, Stephanie Fajardo. However, before I do that, I want to briefly situate my perspective and an overview of some of my previous scholarship. So Platts and Mujado argue that one of the best ways to gain insight into how a society grapples with large-scale societal changes is through reference to horror cinema, the very genre designed to scare, unsettle, and otherwise disturb its audience. Horror cinema ebbs and flows in accordance with diffusely felt trauma, whereby it functions as a conduit for the negative. For many, the 2016 presidential election was a horror film incarnate, with a lot of people finding themselves genuinely afraid of losing their livelihoods, their liberties, and the lovely graces of their planet. During the campaign, Trump candidly and nakedly trafficked in horrific tropes. Taking a historical perspective to the study of monsters, Poole argues that American monsters are born out of American history. They emerge out of the central anxieties and obsessions that have been part of the US from colonial times to the present, and from structures and processes where these obsessions found historical expression. Now, other scholars such as Barbara Creed have drawn on psychoanalytic perspectives to understand representations of horror and monstrosity. Poole argues that monsters are outside of the human psyche, instead grounded in history. These monstrous narratives not only shape identities, they provide a place to hold conversations about our public anxieties. Our monsters register our national traumas. Poole further elaborates that monsters are real in the sense that they not only symbolize things, but they also help to configure worldviews and play a role in those worldviews. Monstrous narratives can be read as a response to a rapidly changing social, cultural, political, and moral landscape. Kendall Phillips asks, what are we to make of those films that seem to have tapped into collective fears of an entire generation? Can we have what film theorist Robin Wood calls collective nightmares? Phillips argues that the success and influence of particular horror films can be correlated to broader cultural anxieties into which they somehow tapped. And similar to Phillips, I ask, what are the collective monstrosities that tap into broader cultural anxieties? Now, both Poole and Phillips greatly inform my thinking about monstrosity in popular culture. Each guide and push me to consider monstrosity not as lingering within the psyche, but instead intimately connected to our past, presence, and futures as a society. As a critical cultural studies scholar, my scholarly and personal commitments lie squarely in the questions of identities: race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ability. A Chicana feminist ethic further impels me to recognize the intersectional nature of our identities and how intersectionalities inform monstrosities. And I further understand how our identities work together to shape our experiences and how we experience the world and how others experience us. As Halberstam notes, monsters are meaning machines. They can represent gender, race, nationality, class, and sexuality in one body. And of course, my approach is further guided by the work of Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, in particular his 7 Theses on monster culture. Cohen's 7 Theses in many ways operate similar to Poole and Phillips' work. However, they offer an overarching framework to think about monstrosity. Cohen argues that the monster's body is a cultural space, meaning that it's an embodiment of a certain cultural moment, of a time, a feeling, and a place. The monster's body quite literally incorporates fear, desire, anxiety, and fantasy, giving them life and an uncanny independence. The monstrous body is pure culture. Likewise, Stephen Asma asserts that the inhumanity of monsters tells us a great deal about our own cultural morals. Cohen further asserts that the monster dwells at the gates of difference as the monster's difference becomes to represent race, nationality, class, gender, ability, and sexuality. Not only do monsters ask us how we perceive the world, they ask us to reevaluate our assumptions about race, gender, and sexuality, our perception of difference, and our tolerance toward its expression. They ask us why we've created them. So in 2015, my book, Monstrosity, Race, and Performance in Contemporary Culture was published, and the text takes a critical approach to the study of monstrosity to consider both literal and figurative or symbolic representations of monstrosity, ranging from an examination of the Aurora, Colorado theater shooter James Holmes and the monstrosity of whiteness to monstrosity and the Gloria Anzaldúa archives. And in 2018, I edited a special issue of the Journal of Popular Culture Studies on monstrosity. More recently, I've been working with Marina Lavina and Kendall Phillips as co-editor of the new Horror and Monstrosity Studies series through the University of Mississippi Press. And over the last few years, I've been interested in the emergence of horror films in the 2000s that can be understood within the frame of feminist horror. For example, I've written about The Lords of Salem, American Mary, and A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which emerged during a time period which has been characterized by many as continuing to wage war on women. This is not coincidental. The rise of conservative politics post 9/11 and the presidency of George W. Bush led to not only increased variations of surveillance and restriction, but also more calls for proposed legislation that would decrease women's control over their own reproductive rights and health. Coupled with these calls in the media, there was a nostalgic turn to the past and flagrant images of hegemonic masculinity through shows like Mad Men, The Playboy Club, and Pan Am. The rise in conservatism and nostalgia can be tied to the 2008 election of Barack Obama, as many whites, particularly white men, symbolically saw their power in decline. Calls emerged for organizing like the White Men's March. Ironically, running concurrent with this backlash was a rise in discourses that espoused the birth of a post-racial and post-feminist period. The sense of increased paranoia in U.S. society post 9/11, the election of Obama, and a collapsing economy that points to the unrealistic nature of the American dream created powerful context for understanding these films and their connection to female agency. And these films point to the limits of post-feminist sensibility that pervades modern U.S. culture and illustrate how horror texts make sense of what it means to be young, female, and post-feminist in the 21st century. Now, more recently, I have returned to race and horror in the analysis of Get Out. Thus, it's important to set the context for this work and this current project that I'll be talking about tonight. As I think I may have mentioned, recent studies have shown that a majority of whites say discrimination against them exists in America today and is as big of a problem as discrimination against racial minorities. There's also a growing sense among whites that white men have been denied rightful opportunities because of perceived increased focus on diversity. Furthermore, we see white women using their votes to support white patriarchy and racialized violence. The previously mentioned studies can be understood in relationship to events such as the Abigail Fisher Supreme Court case, touting discourses of reverse racism and attacks against affirmative action, and the continual state-sanctioned murders of African Americans by the police. These studies must be placed in conversation with discourses of post-racialism after the 2008 election of President Barack Obama and his subsequent re-election in 2012. As Coates suggests, Obama, his family, and his administration were a walking advertisement for the ease with which Black people could be fully integrated into the unthreatening mainstream of American culture, politics, and myth, and that was always the problem. Obama's presidency assaulted the most deeply rooted notions of white supremacy and instilled fear in its adherents and beneficiaries. It became clear, as Coates notes, that race is not simply a portion of the Obama story, it is the lens through which many Americans view all his politics. Similarly, Eric King Watts argues that fantasies of the post-racial depend on and reanimate the affective economies concurrent to the abjection of Blackness. This is so because the post-racial is not a space-time of racial absence or of racial transcendence. It does not signify the dissolution of the brutality of racism. It does not mark the beginning of a universal humanity. And yet, it is not an absurd fiction either. Rather, it registers a reoccurring traumatic condition triggered by ruptures or fractures of a society, felt as threats to the imaginary and symbolic status of masculine whiteness. And as I've discussed in my previous work, this context set the stage for the reemergence of racial nostalgia of the 1950s and hegemonic masculinity that led to films such as American Mary and The Lords of Salem, which explored the horror of white post-feminism. So certainly the facade of the post-racial was publicly ripped away from many liberal whites by the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the increased visibility and mainstream acceptance of white supremacist groups under the banner of the alt-right or white nationalism. The rhetoric of forgotten people or victimized whiteness reemerged even more strongly. Additionally, Allison Reed draws on Wegman, who discusses the white liberal tendency toward a kind of victimized whiteness born out of a class-based solidarity or historical patterns of immigration and racialization. This leads to fallacious claims to pre-white injury, in part motivated by affirmative action backlash and set into motion by the guise of an ordinary discursive blackness that simultaneously particularizes and disidentifies with the political power of white skin. This discursive blackness is guilty of participating in, indeed actively foregoing or forging a counter-whiteness whose primary characteristic is its dissatisfaction from a white supremacist practice. This strategic alignment of discursive blackness and deraciated whiteness reproduces white supremacy under the banner of progressivism. And it's within these contexts that we can situate and understand Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out, which revisits the Guess Who's Coming to Dinner narrative through the lens of horror. The narrative unfolds during the weekend visit to meet his white girlfriend Rose's family, Chris discovers that the family uses a procedure they call the coagula procedure to place parts of their brains, their consciousness in the bodies of African Americans, rendering them as vessels for white consciousnness. In some sense, they become zombies, which Watts suggests occupies a contradictory relation to the logics of the post as it recalls histories of terror, horror, revulsion, slavery, rape, and violence. Through hypnosis by Rose's mother, Missy, the consciousness of their victims are placed in what Missy terms the sunken place. Chris comes to find out his girlfriend and her family's true motives as they violently attempt to perform the procedure on him after he has been auctioned off to the highest bidder, in a scene that harkens back to slave auctions. While many will rightly focus on the character of Chris and what his representation means in this moment, my interest in this project that I just completed is in the representation of Black women in the film, especially as they're positioned in relationship to whiteness, Black masculinity. Kenitra Brooks marks the lack of criticism focused on representations of Black women within horror, and she insists that Black women horror characters, when present, are plagued by their construction as a mistreated tool used to further the more careful and considerate constructions of other characters. Considering identity and politics, Sexton asks us to consider what a shift from a narrow emphasis on the attack on Black masculine empowerment, what used to be called manhood rights, to a far more expansive formation of assault on Black reproductive freedom, asking what might it mean to stand on its head the patriarchal assumption that Black women's suffering is a disgrace to Black men, and rethink the gendered violence against Black men as a component of gendered violence against Black women. And much like Kara Keeling's analysis of the Black lesbian femme character Ursula and Set It Off, I've been interested in what we can learn from the character of Georgina, a woman who we're introduced to as working for Rose's family, yet we come to find out is housing the consciousness of Rose's grandmother. So following dominant cultural logics that frame Blackness through masculinity and womanhood through whiteness, I've explored how the film dismisses the possibility or erases the possibilities of femme queerness in favor of a critique that focuses on the violence enacted against Black masculinity and Black heterosexuality and echoes toward a narrow vision of Black nationalism. The film positions Black women as complicit actors in white supremacy, while Black men perform agency through body knowledges or theories in the flesh as theorized through feminists of color. However, like Douglas, I'm not interested in reifying gender stratifications. Rather, I want to use a Black feminist lens to be inclusive of all genders. Georgina exists in what Sharon Holland terms a queer place, which is not necessarily based in the acts that individuals engage, but instead the coercive norms that place their desires in a position of conflict with the present order. So, having briefly talked through some of my previous scholarship, I want to return to the figure of the clown, specifically Pennywise from It and the Joker from Joker. Poole suggests that early on, critics linked Trump to the figure of the clown, including those from traditionally conservative media. Mary Vail of The Guardian called Trump a gigantic killer clown who used his supporters' despair and hopelessness against them. Poole argues the age of Trump has seen the apotheosis of the clown archetype, symbol and nightmare of folklore and film. He continues, the clown in horror narrative with its obsessive appeal and dangerous terror offers a key to understanding Trump's own politics of horror. Clown horror, Poole argues, engages in a brand of poison nostalgia for small-town America, imagined as facing a dire threat. Second, most cinematic representations of clown horror depend on a sense of aggregated masculinity that explodes in chaotic violence. The inhumane face of the psychotic clown acts as a symbol for American acceptance. Indeed, its obsession with unexpected and unpredictable violence. It's the same face worn by the 45th president, silly, pathetic, without exactly being sad, and seemingly masking a bottomless potential for social, political, and cultural geopolitical mayhem. Now, from American Horror Story, Cult, to It Part 1 and 2, and most recently Joker, we can see clowns emerging in popular culture. And similarly, we see mashups featuring Trump as Pennywise or face painted as the Joker in the tradition of the Heath Ledger's rendition. Aside from this, pundits' descriptions of Trump's appearance and behavior are often framed as outlandish or clownish. The popularity of the Joker as a representation of incel culture, which in many cases can be tied to white supremacist movements, is not coincidental. Additionally, incels or involuntary celibates are steeped in misogyny and general feelings of hate, anger, entitlement, alienation, and anti-socialism. And certainly, someone who espouses of women that you just need to grab them by the pussy echoes the entitlement shared by incels, such as the Santa Barbara shooter whose manifesto decries his inability and anger about not being able to find a girlfriend or any woman who would give him attention. Poole suggests that the nihilism that lurks behind the mask of grim justice really only finds true expression in the Joker's savage willingness to take the use of violence to its illogical conclusion. Certainly, we can see why the Joker has been connected to Trump, as some might suggest that he too is operating with a savage willingness to take the use of violence to its illogical conclusion, such as in the recent case of engagements with Iran. However, what interests me most is the mixing of Trump with Pennywise the Clown, the evil villain in It, who kidnaps and kills children in the 1980s. Nostalgia over the 80s, when Reagan wanted to make America great again, looms large in the film. Likewise, Poole suggests It also displayed an obsession with the fetish of male domination, while Christensen and Hester write that It Part 1 is focused on reifying the idea of young white male innocence. Teresa Geller notes that the nostalgia and banal message of the film have used a little too closely to make America great again. She further argues that It is the first horror film to truly represent Trump's America. Geller writes, certainly the recent Unite the Right protests in Charlottesville were impelled by a similar sentiment as It, as they too stick together and relied on one another's strength, loyalty, and goodness in order to protest in words and deeds now openly expressed under Trump's regime, those who they perceive as evil. Poole shares the expressions of clown horror suggest that Trumpism may be abhorrent, but it's not an aberration in America's deeply violent history. Its roots run deep in the violent settler societies from which the United States emerged, but has gained a special pugnancy in the last 50 years that preceded, and in some ways, in some respects, prepared the way for the rise of Trumpism. The clown and its uncanny powers, monstrous intentions, and alchemy of violence and nostalgia reveals the social mechanicry of power in post-industrial America, Trump's America. Even Comedy Central South Park jumped on the connection between Trump and Pennywise the Clown in Splatty Tomatoes, episode 10 of season 21, in which Mr. Garrison, now fashioned as President Trump, returns to South Park in sightings that are scaring the local children. Released in 2017, It predated Trump's 2018 mass detaining of migrants and caging of innocent children, but it's not a hard leap to see how the image of Trump as Pennywise could take on another level of significance, given not only the detainment, but deaths and sexual violence against innocent children. A year later, in 2019, we would see the release of the major motion picture, The Curse of La Llorona, as part of the successful Conjuring horror universe. And I want you to keep Trump as Pennywise in the back of your mind for a moment. So the film grossed over $54 million in the US and $123 million worldwide. The Curse of La Llorona begins with a very brief scene that references the story of La Llorona beginning in 1673. After she murders her children, we are then taken to 1973, which is interesting given the contemporary calls for nostalgia to make America great again, as well as constant comparisons between the Nixon presidency and the Trump presidency. But very quickly, the film introduces the audience to three major characters: La Llorona, Patricia Alvarado, and Anna Tate Garcia. Anna is a white woman and is introduced as hardworking and stressed. And she's a widow who is trying to maintain a functioning household after the death of her Latino police husband. Patricia is a Mexican-American mother being investigated by Anna, who is a social worker, because she is suspected of child abuse and neglect. Patricia uses mystical and occult methods to try and protect her 2 young sons from being harmed by La Llorona. However, Anna, her caseworker, interferes and takes the 2 boys under CPS protection. This interference is deadly as La Llorona gains access to the boys who are no longer being protected by their mother, and she drowns them in a nearby river. Patricia blames Anna for the death of her sons while also being a suspect in their deaths. Out of rage, the audience later finds out that Patricia has sent La Llorona after Anna's children, and the plot is set in motion. Progressively, Anna and her children experience the terror of La Llorona and begin to look for ways to protect themselves. Anna's eldest son, Chris, tries to imitate his late policeman father in defense of his sister Sam, but is not effective. As a family, they look to a Catholic priest who says he can't help, and they're instead sent to a curandero named Rafael. The curandero is Latino and distrustful of Anna and her family at first, but eventually agrees to help them. Rafael gives Anna and her family instructions on how to protect themselves against La Llorona, and they very closely resemble the methods that Patricia used in the beginning of the film. Rafael sets a trap for La Llorona and is successful in expelling her from the house, but a mistake by Sam lets her in again. La Llorona chases the 2 children up into the attic, and there's a moment when La Llorona is humanized in a flashback of her children, when Chris presents her with the necklace she received as a gift, but the moment is over when she sees herself in the mirror. Finally, Anna comes in and destroys La Llorona by stabbing her with a cross made of the tree that was witness to her original infanticide. Now, Chicana feminists have embraced the figure of La Llorona, the weeping woman, and in some cases have tied her to that of Malitzin de Nepal, the indigenous woman who is a translator and lover of Hernan Cortez, the Spanish conquistador. Scholars such as Gloria Anzaldúa note that there was a story that 10 years before the Spaniards came to Mexico, there was a woman wailing in the streets of the city of Mexico City, saying that proclaiming that the children would be lost, the culture would be lost, that the race would be lost, and that she was in effect predicting the coming of the Spaniards and the loss of the culture, the tribal culture. When Cortez arrived in Mexico, he was given, and I say that, kind of sarcastically, Malitzin, who was said to be between 14 to 16 years old, by Mayan merchants, along with 14 other girls. Cortez passed her on to various men during his lifetime. While she has been constructed as a traitor figure or Mexican Eve by scholars such as Octavio Paz, who refers to her as La Chingada, or the used woman who's disgraced us all as Mexicans, Chicana feminists argue that colonialism would have happened with or without her, and she was not of the age of consent. She acted out of deeply religious beliefs to try and save her people as much as possible. In 1521, Malitzin was said to have given birth to a son, and in 1522, as the story goes, Cortez was preparing to return to Spain to marry a Spanish woman and take their mestizo son Martin with him. Betrayed by Cortez, La Malinche realized the role she played in the massacre of her people and prays to her gods for help and guidance. One god answers her prayers and reveals to her that if she permits Cortez to take their son to Spain, the child would one day return to destroy her people. And a mixture of feeling betrayed and abandoned by Cortez and the guilt of having aided him in the murder of her people and the prophecy of her son continuing the massacre if she allowed him to leave for Spain, La Malinche escapes one night to the lake and stabs the child in the heart before dropping his lifeless body into the water and crying, "Oh, hijo mío." La Malinche dies in 1529, and oral tradition has it that she can be seen at the lake's edge crying out for her dead child, the distinctive epigraph in many La Llorona accounts. Now, there are multiple tellings of the story, which include various motives about why La Llorona killed her children, including to get back at her cheating husband or to marry a man who didn't want to have her children around. In rehabilitating her story, Maria Figueroa sees infanticide as an act of self-mutilation in response to some form of oppression that has been internalized. In other words, the act is committed in reaction against the pain and suffering of oppression. Likewise, Naomi Quinones argues La Llorona selflessly takes the life of her children to save them from the violence of a world that may destroy them and will kill them. Domino Perez, in a critical reading of a contemporary La Llorona narrative, suggests La Llorona's failure to achieve a white middle-class maternal or familial ideal exposes the privileged economic, social, political, and underpinnings of the model American family. I could go on and on from here about La Llorona Malitzin, but I want to return to the film. It's important to contextualize the film with increasing calls to take away women's reproductive rights, anti-Latino rhetorics espoused by the Trump administration, and the increase of white supremacist hate crimes. These issues are salient in U.S. American culture and expressed in the film, which provides a catharsis and a sense of resolution for an audience intention. Additionally, discourses surrounding motherhood, patriarchy, memory, femininity, and abjection are running parallel in The Curse of La Llorona to current events. Writers such as Pilar Malero and Juan Padilla argue that the myth of La Llorona provides a space for discourses surrounding how women position themselves within the construct of motherhood. They argue motherhood is the center of identity out of which women make their choices and out of which they construct their agency. Other writers such as Claudia Arias, Diana Ferrari, Orquídea Morales, and Cristina Santos are more concerned with patriarchal structures and how they created the condition for the creation of La Llorona, as well as how they continue to shape the myth in contemporary society. From these writings, it is implied that La Llorona as monster was created by the violence of patriarchy. According to Gonzalez Herrera and Acala, La Malinche has been constructed as synonymous with betrayal, while La Llorona symbolizes destructive motherhood. And Shane Morman and I have examined how the figure of La Llorona in the film Chasing Poppy is used to regulate not only Latino masculinity, but also citizenship. So in this big screen retelling of La Llorona's myth, a colonial and patriarchal set of values is being expressed in order to respond to the tension surrounding Southern immigrants and women. These values are expressed through the different functions and symbols embodied by La Llorona, Patricia, and Anna, as well as through Anna's relationship to her children and other characters of color. In this film, Anna is positioned as the middle-class, chaste, protective mother whose whiteness and role as social worker allow her to judge Mexican culture while simultaneously using it to hers and her children's benefit. She can easily symbolically stand in for a large number of white women who have helped elect Trump or a member of his administration, such as Kirstjen Nielsen. Patricia is positioned as a poor, superstitious, and neglectful mother, but also as a La Llorona in becoming as she seeks to kill Anna's children out of revenge for losing her own. Her character is always emotionally distressed and is constantly wronged by the institutions of governance that she encounters. She also can symbolically represent the image of Latinas as dangerous by the Trump administration through discourses of mothers wanting to give birth to their children in the US, women demonized as carrying so-called anchor babies. Thirdly, La Llorona is the monstrous mother who drowned her children out of a jealous rage and is seeking to kill more children to replace her own. Symbols surrounding abortion and feminine instability are embedded in the character, and she is treated as a monster who cannot be redeemed. Patricia and La Llorona function in the film as failed mothers, while Anna, who, like of other final girls, is positioned as asexual and solely concerned with the welfare of children. Anna is also the mother to mixed-race children, which mirrors the archetype of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a symbolic mother of Mexico and mestizo culture. Anna/Guadalupe are benevolent mothers of mestizo children who are threatened by the transgressive mothers refusing to conform to their prescribed gender roles. Just as Anna is upheld for her mothering, La Llorona and Patricia are cast as irredeemable monsters for their mothering. Anna and the survival of her children can be read as symbolic of the need for Mexican Americans and other Latinos to assimilate into U.S. culture. The whiteness of her mixed-race children is part of what allows them to survive. Patricia knows that social services and Anna, as a white woman, cannot understand her within her own cultural context, so she retreats from government help and instead turns to religious tools to help protect her from La Llorona. Patricia's situation is reminiscent of La Malinche because they're both caught up in relationships with the authorities of the state and are using their powers available to them to navigate and survive their situations. The implicit message that is being expressed in the film is that Mexican cultural and spiritual knowledge is not important or valuable until it is beneficial to white people. For example, Trump demonizes Mexicans as murderers and rapists, all while screaming to build a wall that the Mexico will pay for. He's illegally employed undocumented workers at his various properties. Thus, we get a similar message in The Curse of La Llorona. The U.S. wants Mexican culture, labor, and resources, but not in the way that considers their needs and safety. It's a racist colonialist mentality that continues to subjugate people of color while simultaneously extracting their culture for white benefit. Just as this mentality is ingrained in US American culture, it is salient throughout the film. A stereotype and common trope is that of the emotionally excessive Latina, and both Patricia and La Llorona fit that mold. Patricia is said to be the angry brown woman when she curses Anna's children to be taken by La Llorona out of revenge for having lost her own children. As Morales mentioned, the myth of La Llorona teaches that women are dangerous, and the La Llorona myth in this film teaches that Mexican women are more dangerous than white women. The film has an imbued narrative about the worthiness of motherhood that is coded by race. The character of La Llorona is completely demonized as an irredeemable character because she chose her feelings over her children, which makes her unworthy of sympathy. Patricia is framed in a similar way by having her be vengeful and attempt to cause deaths of more children out of pain of losing her own. Anna, as the protagonist of the film, is framed as worthy of motherhood, even though her children have brown bodies that she uses to gain access to resources not normally available to her. Anna's whiteness is what saves her and her children because whiteness is portrayed as synonymous with being level-headed, rational, forgiving, and responsible. The issue of intersectionality of identities becomes apparent in the film through the layered portrayal of characters to express white supremacist patriarchal values. Using motherhood as a space for discourses also allows the inequalities in access to reproductive health between white women and women of color to illustrate where progress needs to be made. Additionally, the attempt made by the government to adopt out migrant children who've been systematically separated from their parents at the southern border is continuing a colonialist erasure of culture. And the Curse of La Llorona also speaks to the social anxiety surrounding, quote, illegal immigration, but again, it rewrites the narrative to absolve whiteness from any culpability. The tagline for the film is, "She wants your children." At the southern border, it is not Mexican, Salvadoran, Honduran, or Guatemalan women who are seeking to take children. It's the U.S. Border Patrol and American white families. These facts make many folks uncomfortable and unwilling to engage because it's disruptive for them to acknowledge their complicity in these acts of colonial violence. The impact of the film is held in that it subverts the narrative of colonialism into one that portrays the white woman, an agent of the government, as the good white girl, as the hero, and the Mexican monster as forced stealing of children. The narrative of this film makes it easier to blame Mexican women for the dangers inflicted on their own children, such as saying they are bad parents for bringing their children to cross the border, rather than acknowledging that white Americans and other colonized people of color are complicit in committing acts of violence against children. This displaced blame allows audiences to release their anxieties about their personal racism or indifference for the suffering of people of color. The director of the film, Michael Chavez, explains in an interview that the choice to make the protagonist an outsider to Mexican culture was intentional to produce a sense of discovery for the audience. Like Anna in the film, the producers and directors of the film use Mexican culture and mythology for the entertainment and palatability of white audiences, rather than for the community who produced the basis of the story. This supports the claim that the demonization of Mexican women and Mexican motherhood is for the consumption of white audiences in order to justify colonial violence and racism. While the release and timing of the two films, It and The Curse of La Llorona, may be coincidental, certainly the meanings we can take away when we read them together is stark. The position of Mexican and Mexican American women as bad mothers who cannot protect and in fact place their children in danger runs throughout The Curse of La Llorona, as does the position of white women as representatives of the government who are positioned as much better to make decisions about the needs and care of brown children. Latino men are absolved or simply positioned as mediators, such as Rafael, who helps Anna save her children from La Llorona. We have no idea where the father of Patricia's children is, and the only other Latino man mentioned is La Llorona's husband, who fits the stereotype of the hypersexual Latin lover, as he cheated on her, which led her to kill her children. As we can see in the connection between La Llorona and Malitzin, the theme of the bad mother in Mexican and Mexican American cultures is prominent, particularly when contrasted to the virgin whore dichotomy as represented through the Virgin of Guadalupe. The Southern Poverty Law Center noted that on May 7, 2018, the Department of Justice implemented its zero tolerance policy dictating that all migrants who cross the border without permission, including those seeking asylum, be referred to the DOJ for prosecution. Undocumented asylum seekers were imprisoned, and any accompanying children under the age of 18 were handed over to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which shipped them away miles from their parents and scattered them among 100 Office of Refugee Resettlement shelters and other care arrangements across the country. Hundreds of these children, including infants and toddlers, were under the age of 5. It was noted in November of 2019, that year, that there were 69,550 migrant children held in custody, while 6 died in custody between September 2018 and May 2019. This is not including the number of adults who have died in custody of ICE as well. So, on June 21st, 2018, a date that precedes the release of The Curse of La Llorona, The Onion, an online satire site, ran an article titled "Immigrant Children Terrified at Ghastly Visage of La Llorona in Detention Center," alongside an image of Melania Trump. The story commemorated Trump's visit to Texas, a detention center, as she famously wore a jacket with the message on the back, "I really don't care, do you?" Plates and Mojado note of it that it was the most financially successful horror film of 2017. They suggest Trump's psychopathic nature was seen as being reflected in Pennywise, a soul-devouring clown who awakens from his 27-year slumber to prey on the town's children. It was Stephen King, the author of it, who stated at a women's march in Florida, "We just elected President Pennywise." Likewise, director Andy Muschietti shared, "Fear is used as a tool these days to divide and conquer, and hate is a tool. And that's something Pennywise does, and that's something resonating in our society right now." The circulation of images of Trump as Pennywise and the meanings associated with the Curse of La Llorona are significant as we look at the humanitarian crisis at the border. As Mormon and I have argued, in film, La Llorona can be seen as a guardian or arbiter of U.S. citizenship. Certainly, hegemonic ideologies about paternalism of whiteness or the whiteness as the guardian that knows best are always already circulating at the larger cultural everyday level through news, government, actions, discourses of representative white nationalist movements, as well as conservative evangelical movements. The meanings and messages from these two texts, The Curse of La Llorona and It, augment or support existing attitudes. Brown people, brown children in particular, become less than human, expendable, and pawns of the Trump administration. These images work to help secure consent for what's happening at the border by painting Mexican and Latina women as bad mothers who need the government to intercede for the benefit of their children. So as I finish up, I want to return to the clown sightings. Some have suggested they were part of a marketing stunt for an unreleased short film called Gags. Others warn that they were a precursor to a threatened clown purge in the vein of the Purge films. While these clowns may be gone for now, we can't ignore the proliferation of the clown image in representations of Trump, particularly as Pennywise the evil clown, who, like La Llorona, murders children and again has threatened to come back in a few years. These clowns and Trump's symbolic role as Pennywise are no laughing matter. While he's coming for brown kids now, who knows what the future holds? Will you be a member of the Losers Club who band together to defeat Pennywise? Note here, loser, a popular insult used by Trump. Or will you stand idly by until it's time for him to come for your children? Thank you. All right. Let me stop my sharing screen there.
I was scrambling to take notes.
And my dog burst through the door too. So in case I don't think you could see, but my door in the background suddenly opened. My dog burst through. So it wasn't a La Llorona. It was just my dog.
I was rewatching The Host today. That the film entirely shot on Zoom. And that's a very Host moment. Where to begin? I guess let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin with Clowns in the Woods.
Yes.
So I mean, Greenville, South Carolina, I think is, as you point out, that's notable. Just in terms of its situated locality, being obviously deeply red in terms of the voter block there. I don't think that's even remotely controversial of a claim to make. So what I'm curious about is, because I've been to Greenville, South Carolina, I don't see it as this idea of what I'm going to call Main Street USA for the rest of my discourse here, whereas Derry very much is, right? And what I think is fascinating about this idea is that Derry, of course, is situated in the Northeast, which is juxtaposably politically thought to be the opposite, right? I mean, Maine is kind of exceptional for its bizarre politics, and you certainly could make some penny-wise arguments about the former governor of Maine too, I think. But it is interesting to me that we draw upon a construct of small town America as being time locked, almost in a time capsule, and then that gets cracked open politically every once in a while, and sprinkled quite feverishly with fear.
Yeah.
And it is interesting how hard you hit upon that, because it's this idea of, if that can be corrupted, something to the core of the country can be corrupted, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the argument you have here is that the boogeyman, right? The boogeyman is the one who would by and large be the one that they would be waving banners for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I had done an earlier version of this actually in Greenville,
Okay.
South Carolina. And
Were you at Lander? Where were you?
I was at the school there, upstate. I think that's what it is, University of South Carolina, upstate.
Okay.
And it was fascinating. I was really nervous about what the reaction would be there. And first of all, they were really excited about the first slide with the whole clown sighting in their own backyard. That was something that really got the audience excited. And then once I started talking about, Trump, the clown, I was starting to get nervous. Am I going to be able to make it out of this this room, this auditorium? But actually, I had a good response, and so I was pleasantly surprised. But yeah, I do think it's interesting because it's small town, but it's also in some ways kind of like, I don't know if we want to say the heart of Dixie, right?
I mean, I don't think of Greenville. I mean, I would think of like Savannah or something.
Yeah, well, the South, the heart of that kind of culture, some part of that culture, right? But yeah. And even in where I live in Spokane, we are in the rural area of Washington State, and I can see similar kind of boogeyman operating here, and the kind of support of the boogeyman here.
What's it? I mean, because I was joking around about Halloween and the use of the boogeyman in Halloween, obviously, but it is always these small towns, right? Mm-hmm. Where the projection or the cipher is. I mean, even more recently, probably in pop culture, I think like Slender Man, right? Mm-hmm. It's a small town where this happens.
Right.
So are these boogeymen sort of a doppelganger for the corruption of a 1950s American dream? Are all of them that?
Could be. I mean, certainly we could see that with the kind of the Trump boogeyman. With La Llorona, it's a pre-colonial
yeah,
nightmare, but for
that's
sure.
Not a specific one to America. I mean, you're linking it up here in an interesting way, but I mean, in terms of these like American born I don't know, horror anchor babies, to borrow a term here, the ones we self-create, these weird mythologies that we create, I don't know, because I'm thrusting myself back, because Make America Great Again, right, is an iteration of the Reagan slogan, mm-hmm. Make America Great. Okay, so let's go back to the 80s to figure out what we're talking about here. And you think, okay, Well, what are we looking at? We're looking at Jason Voorhees up in Crystal Lake. We're looking
Yes.
at Elm Street. You know, this is where we're looking at. Again, it's all small town Americana. Again, this very Disneyfied Main Street USA that's being corrupted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. I'm right there with you. Michael Myers.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I've been, as you know, been thinking about the '90s a lot, and the opposite happens, right? It's all urbanized, right? Candyman is in a city.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, there's this kind of like this racial nostalgia, right?
Yeah.
That continues to come back up. And again, thinking about how if we want to tie it to this Pennywise lore, what doesn't he come every
27
years, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, there's the lore, there's the coming back for us.
Yeah, so I mean, I wonder a lot, and I wonder a lot about the American dream. Like I actually think about this a lot because I think the contemporary idea of the American dream is, as you kind of put it, the 1950s. And I think before that, it's probably the Gilded Age. If I had to pick two time periods when it was in existence.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are both times of extreme racial strife in the country, with policy development that is deeply segregationist on different grounds, but they're pretty linked in that way. So it is interesting when you think about Make America Great Again, Make America Great from Reagan. Which one are you talking about? Probably the 50s. What does that imply? And it doesn't imply anything, good, because you don't get a shift in that. I mean, until President Johnson, really.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, almost 27 years, right? So yeah. I think that there's an odd conspiracy theory to be found here too, that runs deeper throughout it. You brought up James Holmes pretty early on too, of the Aurora, Colorado shooter, which is another thing that I've been fascinated by for a very long time, because he was, of course, obsessed with the Heath Ledger Joker. In a strange way. I mean, he dyed his hair orange, though, I think, if I recall. But my thoughts on James Holmes were that he performed a narrative of fear. That was always my reading of him, because he projected it online long before he enacted it. I mean, he went on dating sites and said things like, "Will you still date me when I'm in jail?"
Right.
And so I began thinking this was when I was in grad school, this happened, and I began thinking a lot about the idea of the performance of fear and the constructed character of fear. And that seems to be something you're saying here too, in relationship to this.
Definitely. And, for the James Holmes thing, that was really personal to me, because that was my movie theater.
Oh.
And we were supposed to go that night. See
wow.
the midnight show. And so I was very personally shaken by that. So I felt like I had to write about it and the way he was being redeemed by the media, through this narrative of kind of small, this good white boy gone bad, shaken by the corruption of the surrounding area of Colorado, coming in contact with otherness, that kind of thing. So again, it's this narrative of white innocence, white male innocence, The other thing too that I've been interested in when you were talking earlier about this Make America Great Again is the rise of some of the kind of re-rising of some of this kind of hillbilly horror, and I'm thinking, and you and I were looking at earlier at your mug. I was thinking earlier about Twin Peaks: The Return.
Yeah.
you know, and
25 years.
yes, the horror of Twin Peaks: The Return, part of it is the class abjection that happens in that show, right? And so I think that for me, this film um, follows that, because I see Twin Peaks: The Return as very much a story of 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 the forgotten people.
It
Right?
is. And people are redeemed. That
Yes.
the quasi, his name is escaping me. He was a quasi villain in the original series, and then he becomes a deputy
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
return. His
Bobby.
name is Bobby. Thank you.
Briggs, yes.
Yeah. I mean, he
Yes.
wasn't a good character in the
No.
original.
No, Bobby killed a guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been thinking about all of this universe basically of like what is the horror after Trump, or what is the post-Trump horror? And so for me, I mean, some of it even preceding his presidency, right? And so thinking about like Twin Peaks: The Return, and thinking about this whole narrative of hillbilly horror resituating itself, and then how the horror then becomes this whole thing of Trump's narrative.
Yeah.
Trump's narrative. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I've kind of just the stream of consciousness I've been thinking about for a while.
No, I think you're right. Tasha Taylor is coming on the 23rd, and she writes a lot about hillbilly horror. So maybe we'll get some more answers.
Yeah.
With that. Yeah. Speaking of stream of conscious, trying to make sense of my notes here. I'm going to shift to Obama briefly in relationship to all of this, because when you were talking, I coined a phrase in my notes, the Stepford problem. And I think that that's sort of this interesting neoliberal way to describe the reactionary quality to Obama. Because what fascinated me, and I guess was missing for me as a juxtaposition point to all of this, is interesting. Obama was always compared to Hitler. And when he was caricatured, he would turn into Hitler. So you're a progressive Hitler, whatever that means. And so it is interesting to say that it is an entire sort of like familial issue, right? It's the fact that you do have sort of like a non-divorced dad with sort of like just almost the Rockwell painting. God, I'm blanking on it. It's one of his 3 civil rights paintings. It's the one with the family moving into the neighborhood, and the African-American children have a white cat and the white children have a black dog, and they both play baseball. But it's almost sort of like that. It's that recognition of the civil rights into these integration points that then sort of needs to be like rebelled against as hard as possible. It's like you've assimilated too much.
Exactly.
And I think it's interesting that, the idea of abjection in relationship to assimilation, because that's not something you normally would think about.
Yeah. And the fact that when we're talking about Mexican folks or other South and Central American folks, the fact that they are rendered almost unassimilatable or whatever in a lot of popular culture, right?
Right.
And so this is again what we see with the film with La Llorona, and kind of the previous film that my colleague and I wrote about, Chasing Poppy, literally has a Mexican American woman as a government agent who works for like I think she works for like INS or something like that. So dealing with the citizenship issue that directly, I think, is really interesting. How, like, yeah, we've got this history of civil rights, and we've got this kind of this history of how folks have been able to assimilate or not. And then we've got this other population that is seen as totally unwanted and unassimilationable, unless it's like, we have these programs in the past, like the Bracero program, where you can come and be a guest worker for a while, but then you got to leave, right? So there's some value there, but that value is not something that is something that is desired for the long term.
It is interesting because if you think about like I guess conservative politicians with a Latino problem, let's say.
Yeah.
I'm thinking particularly Ted Cruz,
Right.
and I'm thinking Marco Rubio, right?
Yeah.
Ted Cruz going so far as to push a strange narrative in relationship to Canada.
Mhm.
I mean, dropping his actual name, which is Raphael, right? But pushing a weird narrative for a person who has presidential aspirations, pushing a strange relationship to Canada, which, in theory would make him ineligible. And then Marco Rubio sort of like vacillating between sort of a performative whiteness, except for when he needs the votes in Miami.
Right. Yeah. And both of them, their relationship to Cuba, right? And the whiteness of Cubans in kind of political discourse and political imaginaries, right? Versus kind of the brownness of everyone else who is Latino, but not Cuban. So, yeah.
And that was a move by Trump against Cruz, right? Was to create a conspiracy theory around him in Cuba and the assassination of JFK.
Right. And let's throw in some Zodiac killer there too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the JFK one's rather interesting too, though, because like he's deploying JFK in his benefit for presumably to secure white Catholics.
Right. Well, and also the interesting part of it is that there are a lot of Latino folks who, I mean, I grew up with, my grandparents, and on my grandfather's shed, he had a big picture of John F. Kennedy. So a lot of Mexican folks who see Kennedy and, Mexican Catholics seeing Kennedy as this kind of really important figure.
Oh man, we're in the weeds, Bernadette.
We certainly are.
It's funny because I was a big fan of the Tim Curry Pennywise, which reads much differently. But when a friend of mine, Drew, and I used to ride bikes because I grew up on an island, and we would ride them through these trails in the marshes. And one of our favorite things to do was to say "clown" as we would drive past weird things. It was just funny that, because I lived in a small town, obviously, it's just funny that the clown thing came again to be, and I was very fixated on it as well at the time. I also was thinking about, again, in terms of cultural nostalgia and warnings of this, I was thinking back to the Twilight Zone, and I was thinking of the Dennis Hopper episode, He's Alive, if you're familiar. That's the one where he's giving they're obviously crypto-fascist speeches Dennis Hopper's character is giving them. And this shadowy Phantom of the Opera figure is giving him the words to say, almost like Cyrano de Bergerac or something. And it turns out it's actually Hitler has escaped through South America and come back into the United States to create the dialogue through Dennis Hopper. So I'll leave that one hanging out there as fruit.
I'm going to have to check that out now.
I was thinking that you brought the Joaquin Phoenix Joker, which I actually think is the more apt one in some ways in this analysis, though I think perhaps the scene of the Heath Ledger one burning the pile of money much could be made of, particularly when I think of sort of spending. But I guess the other figure that was missing here for me too was just a relationship to Steve Bannon and the idea of destructuring systems. And I guess, I mean, Heath Ledger says that too as the Joker, right? I'm an agent of chaos.
Yeah. And I guess too, I want to give a shout out to Kendall Phillips, who's done some recent work on the Joker, the more recent movie. And I want to get into some of that to think about how it might inform some of this. But yeah, I do think you're right. Bannon, the agent behind the scenes, right?
Well, because I think, in some ways, I think of if I had to analyze this in regard to that, I would think of Bannon as the Joaquin Phoenix, and I would think of Trump as the Robert De Niro, right? Because I always had this conspiracy theory of my own anyway in relationship to all this, that The Apprentice was an aggregation site for viewer data. And it reminded me of House of Cards with Kevin Spacey when he sort of like collects all this data that would be illegal to collect otherwise. But if you have a popular TV show, it's quite fine to collect that kind of data.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like how I would read some of this into there personally. The other thing with the Joaquin Phoenix, I'm going to get a bit Freudian here. If we do read Trump into the Joaquin Phoenix Joker, you do have an interesting relationship to fathers and sons and brothers.
Oh, yeah.
Right, with Bruce Wayne being the presumed brother and the better brother, whereas Trump's is obviously the dead brother. And then the long-standing relationship with his father that sort of like drives a lot of the a lot of the socio-political issues starting in the 1970s, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it'd be interesting because I started looking at some of these images 2019, and that's when I started to see a lot of these memes come up around Trump being the Joker. It'd be interesting to see though if there would be more recent ones that use the Joaquin Phoenix depiction of the Joker correlated.
Also, I mean, the Joaquin Phoenix Joker, right, is Nixonian.
Mm-hmm.
70s. You're in 70s Manhattan, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
This has come up a couple times. Brandon Grafey has kind of made very similar points around the Omen in this. So I think there's something there. I was doing the math with him about sort of like, how old would the Antichrist be? 56? Right? If Damien were actually around, he would be about 56 right now. Just to throw that out there if we want to try to identify who that might be. Because we're also talking about, the idea of speaking of ideas like motherhood in relationship to the Antichrist, we were talking about like Rosemary's Baby being the logical prequel to The Omen. Anyway, that apparently Kendall says thanks.
Oh.
So he is watching. So he's heard all these wonderful anecdotes about himself. This is partially a Kendall Phillips tribute episode.
Exactly. We could go on and on.
I know. I got his books right here. We just pull them down. Trying to remember what I was thinking here. I've got the imagined horror versus the lingering horrors of American history. I think what I was thinking here is this idea of race in America that, and this I'm specifically talking about mid-19th century, right before the American Civil War, about 1850, just as a arbitrary choice of time. But ideas of otherness and brownness and blackness being sites of monstrosity at that time, particularly Frankenstein. That's what you see in the cartooning, right? And what's interesting to me when you're talking about Get Out in relationship to this is the idea of the female becoming monstrous through sort of like assertions of masculine power. And so it's almost like it's usurping that history into itself.
Yeah, it's interesting because Elizabeth Young, I really, in that piece on Get Out, I looked at some of Elizabeth Young's work on the Black Frankenstein, but specifically her essay on, or chapter, I should say, on the Bride of Frankenstein, and kind of the way that the rejection that she places upon the monster who comes to represent blackness, right? What's interesting though about that is that she codes the bride as being white. And so it'd be interesting to think about how we can read some of that into this narrative of Get Out with Georgina and the character of Georgina. But yeah.
Well, I mean, generationally, how old would she be?
Georgina?
Yeah, the real sort of consciousness, which is like the
She would be,
pseudoscience.
yeah, in her like she'd be probably in her 70s, probably.
So I mean, that there's
Yeah,
definitely a sense of juxtaposition there between the two.
for sure.
I don't know why. I was thinking a little bit older.
Maybe so, maybe in her 80s.
What do you think the greatest societal American horror is?
The greatest societal American horror
Yeah.
is anti-blackness.
Is it?
Yeah.
I don't actually have an answer. I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a culture of anti-blackness, which filters down to everything else, but it's a guiding principle that that we were just talking about this in my class. Right now I'm teaching an intro class to ethnic studies, and we were talking about this in terms of necropolitics and stuff like that. And so that's kind of what I see as
it's certainly an origin point.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look to William Blake, I mean, he's an American, but the book 5 Years Voyage to Suriname was obviously very popular in America. Mm-hmm. Or if you look to Washington Irving, if you look at those early versions of horror, yeah, I can definitely see the lineage then through Poe and Lovecraft, and then bouncing forward as this specter.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious too, and you might not know this, and I don't know this. Where did La Llorona perform the best financially in the United States? Like what region?
I don't know that, but I would assume it would be in the Southwest.
I would say it's the Midwest where I'm sitting.
Really?
Horror so horror does the best right where I'm sitting.
Oh wow.
At least it used to. And the big citation for that is the torture porn era.
Oh yeah.
So Saw and Hostel, and of course the Passion of the Christ. So that performativity, especially around violence, does the best in the Midwest. And so I would just be curious if there was a parallel there, because I think there would be a lot that could be unpacked, particularly in relationship to the evolution of neoconservatism in this reading.
Oh gosh, for sure. For sure.
So,
yeah, I had thought about the Southwest just because there's been a lot of traction over the last couple of years to try and get a good La Llorona movie made. There was a movie called Her Cry, La Llorona Investigation, which was one of those found footage ones.
Okay.
I would not recommend it necessarily, but it gained a lot of infamy and regionally when I was living in Denver at the time. And so I'm just thinking about, given the kind of the population, the Latino population, and the desire for these kinds of narratives, that there might be a lot of folks going out to see something like this in this movie too. Yeah.
When I lived in California in grad school, I used to go to Halloween Horror Nights all the time at Universal.
Oh, yeah.
And they did a maze, like a haunted house of La Llorona, several times, and it was super popular. It was really well done. I mean,
yeah.
It definitely it was interesting because it felt more European when they did it than it did Latin America.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's true, but I had heard that they were doing another one of our monsters, the Kukui. So who knows?
That one I don't know, but I did see the La Llorona maze. Actually, I saw it in Florida too. You did bring up, and I'd written it down before you mentioned it. Christina Santos agrees with the cry comment, I'm told.
Christina Santos is awesome. I teach Christina Santos's work in my courses, and she has really influenced me a lot. So I want to give another shout out there to another academic hero.
Well, she'll be on in 5 days.
I saw.
So I'd pre-written down the Melania's La Llorona. The interesting thing here too is, I mean, the critique of her too was that she had an anchor baby in the form of Barron Trump, And again, I have another sort of Freudian read here of the removing and displacing of heirs of the father conquistador.
Mhm.
So I love it when you're on because you just agree with me a lot. It makes me feel so much smarter than I generally think of myself as being.
No, you always bring these new readings that I had not even considered, and I'm thinking like, okay, let me think about this.
But I mean, it is interesting because that was a deep, because she was on a genius visa,
right,
in the country before she married the Donald. And he does view himself, I think, especially in the 80s. I think think of all the gold he surrounds himself with. What more conquistador imagery do you need than surrounding yourself with this faux American Versailles style? Like even his toilets on his plane are gold. I mean, that's not political, that's factual, and that's
right.
And then he also lives in a dynastic castle in Mar-a-Lago.
Exactly.
In a Spanish state.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I agree.
I give that to you.
That's a really good point.
This is just a random thought I had too here. The idea of passing, and by passing I mean racial passing, and horror, which is something I hadn't ever thought about until you started talking tonight. And I'm wondering if maybe you have thoughts on the idea of passing and horror, or if you could give any other thought or any ideas you have about that as a concept.
Well, I mean, generally, when I think about it, I think about, when we talk about Latino studies and the work there, just generally that the characters generally have to be white enough. They have to be white, but they have to have a little bit of imbued with a little bit of otherness to recognize them as other, a little bit of, so quote unquote, spiciness that we recognize as other by the American imaginary, right? And so, the idea is that the Latino or Latina characters, Latinx characters, are generally seen as being the closest to whiteness in some ways. And I can see how that could happen in horror. Although I have a hard time thinking about who are the Latino characters in horror.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's why I think this movie was so, people really wanted this movie. And I have to say, I don't think this is a good movie at all.
No, Juan and I have talked about this movie quite a lot, and we were just like, yeah.
But I mean,
it doesn't have to be a good movie to have like a cultural point.
Right.
I mean, you and I'd be out of business if we waited for only good movies to come out.
Right. I mean, I guess the other thing we could think about is with the Latino horror characters are people like Salma Hayek, and From Dusk Till Dawn, right? What's his name? Danny Trejo. But that's a very Mexican setting.
That's also just, I mean, it's so exploitative too.
Exactly.
I mean, it's so old school in the levels of exploitation. I mean, it's almost it's got Quentin Tarantino in it, but it's also weirdly got George Clooney in it.
Right.
But it's very grindhouse. It's not of its time.
Right. Well, and the other thing I will say is I think one of the most interesting set of folks doing work right now in Latino horror is Lucha Gore Productions. And I have a piece coming out. It's not out yet, but it's about a short film called El Gigante. It's about a wrestler who kills people in the ring at the border, a family of cannibals who has this wrestler who kills people, and they eat the people that they kill in the ring. But it's all about the family. It's a lot of it. The family is Mexican, or the family is like Mexican American, and they're cannibalizing Mexican people. So there's tension
Borderland there. Have you seen that one?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same idea, right?
Yeah.
They're cannibals and cocaine dealers.
Yeah. So Lucha Gore horror, I guess that's where I'm seeing a lot of the Latino folks and self-produced Latino made horror.
I'm surprised there's not more border, like, because I went to school at UC San Diego for my PhD, and I'm really surprised that there's not a lot more like Tijuana based horror.
Right. I mean, we see a lot of bad La Llorona movies, but yeah, I don't see a lot of like, that I was thinking about, I've been rewatching the X-Files,
Okay.
and there's the story of a couple of them that come through, like the one about the, what do you call that guy? The Chupacabra,
Okay.
right? There was a bad B movie that came out a few years ago around the border, called A Mexican Werewolf in Texas. So, you see these low budget kind of things, but nothing that's really like great big budget, big studio films.
Juan was wondering what your thoughts on Gomez Pena and the use of American Anxiety is.
Guillermo Gomez Pena.
Yes.
So I've actually written about Guillermo Gomez Pena, and I really like Gomez Pena's work. And we did a colleague, Michelle Holling, and I did a piece on the show Border Brujo, and talked about his exorcism of cultural anxieties, and how he creates a shamanistic character to exorcise the demons of cultural imperialism and cultural anxieties of the Americas. So that's my thoughts. I think there are some critiques around sexism and things like that, but I love Guillermo Gomez Pena's work. I just showed my students The Couple in the Cage, which is the piece he did with Coco Fusco, where they go around and act as if they are this lost tribe that are exhibited in this cage. And It's an art piece, and the people think it's real.
No, I worked with Coco Fusco at University of Florida.
Oh, that's awesome. And I really am interested in this whole Planet of the Apes thing, this Madame Zira stuff that Coco Fusco's doing more recently.
No, yeah, that was a bizarre performance piece, and actually the mental strain of the piece is some of the more interesting stuff to read.
I bet.
In terms of like the diary from the piece. Let me see. Monster got that. I was thinking too about the women in the Trump administration, to return to this. I was thinking Elaine Chao, the Secretary of Transportation, Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, and Christian Nielsen as Homeland Security, which I think you mentioned, Nielsen. Mm-hmm. It is interesting just how ghoulish, for a very bad pun, you sort of saw them morph into, particularly DeVos and Chao, right? And I mean, Chao certainly by way of her marriage to Mitch McConnell as well.
The Grim Reaper.
Well, you also see him quite frequently depicted as sort of the blanking on the Adam West era Joker. Mm-hmm. And so it is interesting, what positions these people were in relationship to, if you think about traditional ideas about the American dream.
Oh gosh, let's also think about what Linda McMahon, Small Business Administration, coming from WWE.
Right. Well, it's all a show, right? What would a clown be without a free ring circus, right?
The clown.
No, truly fascinating, because I've been, as you know, locked in the 90s thinking about all these political things, and so I shut my brain down about the year 2000. I just pull, when we get the Blair Witch, I pull the trigger and I just collapse like an animatronic.
Well, the 90s were the best time, and that's actually one of the things too with going back for a second to Twin Peaks, and even these, to be tangential, the prequels the sequels, Star Wars sequels. I feel like they all have this Generation X vibe to them. The Twin Peaks: The Return, and the prequels, like Luke let the old things die, like all of this. So I don't know.
You're saying they're all zombies?
Yeah. Let the old things die.
That's what Lawrence Rickles would have said, I think, that they're the second death. They need to die their second death so they can be forgotten.
Yeah. Yep.
I will say with the Twin Peaks, The Return, though, I mean, the series did end with with Laura Palmer saying, "I'll see you again in 25 years," and
Yeah.
they did it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
That's such a hard piece to digest, the third season of Twin Peaks. Like, I feel like that could be months of discussion unto itself, just
Yeah.
with some of the impenetrable layers.
For sure.
But again, a melange of whiteness. I mean, you are situated in the Pacific Northwest right now yourself. So,
Well, this is one of the reasons why I moved here, because of the Twin Peaks connection. And, and we finally see in the third season that he says, let's charter a plane to Spokane. Right. So I'm like, yes, this is where I'm going.
So you're actually a Twin Peaks character, is what you're telling me.
Definitely.
And actually, if I recall, last year your backdrop was the Black Lodge.
It was. So it comes full circle.
We did it. I want to thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I could talk to you all night about so many different things, I'm quite sure. And maybe one time we will. I want to invite everybody to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats right now. I also want to invite everybody to tune in tomorrow night for Henry Ansgar Kelly, and to remind you, as always, to stay spooky. Oh man, yeah, my brain went in so many different directions when I was just trying to keep up.
It was fun. It was fun. Like, my brain can't stop going in all these directions. That's why I'm having trouble kind of just stopping it.
I'll tell you a weird piece of, I mean, it doesn't particularly relate to yours, but I haven't ever discussed it with anyone. I'm hung up with Creepshow 2 and Old Chief Woodenhead and the cigar store Indians at all the Disney parks on Main Street, USA.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I'm just obsessed with that as a concept.
Yeah. Definitely.
Because I worked for Disney for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm aware that it's supposed to be, it's always the 4th of July on Main Street, USA, except for Christmas Day, which is why you always have fireworks at Disney Park. But I'm obsessed with it being Gilded Age America time locked as this idea of the American dream, or especially Walt Disney's American dream, and what that means in terms of, a certain type of filmic history.
Yeah. My dog has burst in again.
It's like, I need attention. What is this academic nonsense you're doing? Why do you have to give papers?
Exactly. She said, come on, Mama.
Yeah, I need to look up more about this idea of border horror.